Good afternoon. Warm welcome to Ruth and Idan from Israel on this very interesting conversation we're going to have in the next 30 to 45 minutes. And a warm welcome to all the participants who joined us this afternoon to hear us hear about combinatorial pooling in clinical diagnostics of infectious diseases. I'm happy to host both Ruth and Idan, and we have been working with them on trying and testing some of these methods as a method of scaling up for COVID testing and have very interesting outcomes and success with the methods. Ruth is CEO of LessTests, which is an SAMD company using software as medical diagnostics. She founded the company that uses combinatorial pooling for smart diagnostics, and the company was founded in March 2020 at the wake of the pandemic, and subsequently LessTests has received the first regulatory approval in the world for single-step combinatorial pooling. The pool testing software enables assay independent increase by scale up to 2x to 15x depending on the disease prevalence, and thus saving time and costs. Ruth previously built and managed She Codes. This is the largest community and training organization for software engineers in Israel, and has several thousand members and over 50 branches across the country, spreading universities and leading tech companies, including Google, IBM, Microsoft, and Facebook. Ruth deservedly has been named by Forbes as one of the most influential women in Israel, and by the Marker magazine as one of the most influential people in Israel. Thank you, Ruth, for joining us this afternoon. The other speaker I'd like to introduce to you is Idan. Idan Elin is the head of pathogen genomics research at Kishoni Lab in Technion University in Israel. He specializes in high throughput sequencing and medical big data analysis. His main research interests include evolution of bacteria, both in the clinic and in laboratory experiments, with focus on evolution of antibiotic resistance. In the field of antibiotic resistance, Dr. Elin has recently developed an algorithm for personalized prediction of UTI's resistance profile, urinary tract infection resistance profiles. During the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, he has been working on methods for efficient COVID-19 testing and surveillance. A very warm welcome to you, Idan. And we will the speakers will talk to us shortly. And before that, Dr. Venkatesh will briefly introduce Genotypic to the audience, and then we will have Ruth start her presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Venkatesh.
Hello, everyone. This is Venkatesh Krishnamurthy, and I take care of the Genotypic product unit. I also have my colleague, Mrs. Divya Shetty, application specialist, to answer any queries on your behalf. Also, Dr. Sudha will be there. And we'll just briefly introduce you to our company and what we do. So to begin with, as a pioneering genomics company, we have over the last 2 decades enabled technology adoption for biological research across academia and industry. Our endeavor is to bridge the gap between biology and technology. Amongst the many firsts, we are also the first and the only distributor for nanopore products in India, and we are also the certified service provider for Oxford Nanopore Technologies in India. In order to support the fight against ongoing COVID pandemic, Genotypic has taken a lot of initiatives, both in terms of products and services. Through our product division, we provide a complete solution to NGS labs for sequencing and analysis of SARS-CoV-2. We provide all the reagents required for the amplification of the viral genome, for library preparation, and sequencing along with Minion sequencers and control systems. We also provide other nanopore platforms that scientists worldwide are using to sequence SARS-CoV-2. We also provide data analysis solution through our Commander software that will make analysis a very simple affair with built-in pipeline for SARS-CoV-2 genome sequencing. In case there are any queries regarding our products, you can directly reach out to us. Through our service division, we provide whole genome sequencing, metagenome sequencing, and direct RNA sequencing of SARS-CoV-2. In case there are any more queries for customized services, please feel free to reach out to us at the contact details given in the slide. We also conduct webinar series on recent developments in trending areas every month. If you are interested in attending these webinars, please make sure you follow Genotypic Technology on Facebook, on our LinkedIn, Twitter, and we keep posting our updates and registration links for your benefit. We thank you for joining this webinar, and we do hope you will enjoy it.
Thank you, Venkatesh. Over to you, Idan. Would you like to start your presentation?
Yes, thank you, if that's okay. Let me just share my screen.
Sure.
Hi. So first, I'd like to thank you for this invitation and for this opportunity to present some of our research from the last year, from the recent pandemic, you could say. So I'm a researcher at the Technion, and I also a consultant for LessTests, which Ruth will present more broadly later on. So I want to start with something that happened very early in the pandemic. Actually, in the middle of March already, there was like a brainstorming meeting of Ministry of Health and academics, trying to raise ideas of how what can basic science contribute to fighting this this pandemic at the very early stages. And one of the ideas that came from our lab, from actually a master student in our lab, she said, okay, maybe let's do something very basic. Let's do pooling. Let's test many samples together. And the reason was that at the time, and it hasn't changed that much since, there is a problem in throughput. At the time, sometimes it's swabs, sometimes it's the kits, sometimes it's just money, just the costs of these tests. And she said, let's try to see if pooling can work. And that's what we did very early on in the pandemic, when there weren't actually that many tests like there are today. So we collaborated with a hospital here in Haifa, a tertiary hospital, a Rambam Medical Center, and we went there and we took just all the positive samples, and they only had a couple of dozen samples at that moment, very early on March, and we picked just a few positive samples. We looked at the CTs of the different genes, and you can see them here. So the distribution, you could say, of the strength of these samples. That was something to begin with, and then we simply pulled them together. We just did serial dilution of a positive sample within negative samples to see whether how far can you go, how many dilutions can you do and still clearly see the positive sample, a sample that you already know is positive. And as you can see here, if you dilute by 2, by 4, by 8, by 16, all these things work very, very nicely. We did have a slight issue with diluting at 32 and 64, although we do know, and we also saw that it works most of the time. But true, we should maybe, but our conclusion at the time was that maybe you shouldn't go that far. And then we ask ourselves, okay, if you dilute the sample, does it behave as expected? Do you see the increase in CT, right? As expected or something different? We immediately found that the increase is of 1.24 of CT per every times 2 dilution, and we had something going wrong only for one of the samples. And I must say, we had only one chance to do this experiment because positive samples at the time were extremely scarce. So it was a one shot to do this experiment. And here you can see pool size and the change in CT going, I would say, as expected for these samples. And again, at that point, people were asking, okay, so you took the RNA and diluted it. That's one thing. But if you really want to do pooling and to do it in large scale and put it into the existing systems, what you really want to do is dilute the samples, or let's say combine the samples, pool the samples already before RNA extraction. So we actually did also that, and we did that specifically for pools of 8, and I'll say something about that in a second. And we looked at the change of CT when pooling samples in pools of 8, and you can see a very slight, or let's say again expected, increase in CT for these pooled samples, also when pooled before RNA extraction. Now, why pools of 8? A pool of, you know, on one hand, one can say, okay, let's pool 100 samples together. Potentially, it can save us a lot of money. But when you think about it more clearly, the right pooling, the right size of a pool has to do with the expected prevalence in the population. And actually, it's one over the square root of the prevalence in the population, which means if the prevalence in the population is 1%, then the relevant pool size is of 10. Only if the prevalence in the population is, let's say, 1 to 1,000, right? You expect 1 in 1,000 samples to be positive. Only then do you want a pool size of, let's say, 30. Okay, and unfortunately, this is currently not the case. We're not experiencing such low prevalences, and therefore a pool of 8 or 10 is actually what a reasonable pool to do. And lastly, we also found that we can actually also go the other way around. If you measure a sample in a pool and you measure the CT of each one of these genes, we're talking about the C gene kit here. We look at the E gene, RDRP, and N gene. If you look at the CT that was measured in the pool, you can actually go back. You can reverse engineer. You can find what was the CT of these genes. What would have been the CT of these genes in the original sample. So you can actually still return an answer or like a test result, which pretty much resembles what clinicians are familiar with or usually work with. So that was the last part of this series of experiments. This part was actually already done with LessTests in using their equipment and setting. And at this point, I'd like to briefly acknowledge people involved in this research. The first part of the research, not related to LessTests, which was done by the Kishoni lab at the Technion, which you can see here, and Yuval and Moran from Rambam Hospital. So that was my short, let's say, introduction to what we've done with pooling. And if there's any question, I can take it now, or maybe after Ruth presents the second part. Thank you.
Thank you, Idan. We'll probably reserve the questions for after both the talks are done. Thank you. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you, Idan. As Idan mentioned, we've been working together with Idan and the research they started in the Technion about pooling. And we basically, when we launched the company, our goal was to take it into practice. So we knew that pooling has been widespread practice in biology, but not in wide usage in most labs, especially relating to COVID. And that was our goal. So we basically launched on the journey to make that happen. I'll take a few words to just explain, first of all, what is combinatorial pooling. And then I'll continue. Idan started discussing city value calculation. This is something that the more work we're doing and we see in practice, the more data we have on it, and actually becomes more and more accurate as time goes on. So that's actually fascinating to see. Of course, depends on lab equipment and so forth, but I'll touch on that. And at the end, I'll discuss what other usages we can look at. So history of pooling. Pooling was basically started in World War II. A lot of people say that times of crisis generate a lot of innovation. In World War II was no different. Usually it's discussed in the context of computers and cybersecurity, especially with Israeli technology. But when you're looking at biology, actually pooling was also invented in World War II. Probably a lot of the traumatic World War I, where a lot of the soldiers actually died from pandemic, the Spanish flu. But in World War II, there was also syphilis was very prevalent. And Dr. Robert Dorfman invented it by taking every soldier that was drafted. He made sure to test him for syphilis, and he did it in very similar to what Idan described. Simple pooling. You basically you can see here in the diagram. First, you look at the left side, which is basically the first step. You take 5 samples. The top part, you can see here, the top part, basically 5 negative samples, which get pooled into one pool. And here you have, despite the fact that you have 5 samples, one of them is positive, and the entire pool is positive. And then you have to take a second step and basically open the pool up and test the 5 pools. And after you do the first step, where you see that pool A is negative, you do not have to test individually pools 1 to 5. Whereas pool B, you do have to test individually, and this is on the right side. You see the second step, you do have to individually test samples 6 to 10, which basically involves more time, because depending on your time to result of sample to result time, basically you have to take the sample and retest it, all the samples within the pool. And if we're looking at mega lab, with some of the labs we're working with have capacity of 40,000 samples per day, it's not practical to work in scale using pooling in this context. And therefore, there are other solutions, and I'll discuss in a second, but the main part is the time, and also the cost. Of course, Idan mentioned looking at the stage at which the pooling is done. And once it's done before the extraction, you save a considerable amount on the materials. So when you're looking at scale, this is something that also reduces involving that. Now, the cumbersome 2-step could be solved by combinatorial pooling. Now, this is something combinatorial or matrix pooling is basically taking a lot of samples and building them, setting them up in a matrix. And I'm going to give a few words. I'm going to assume some of you have never been exposed to this. So I'll go into some detail, but if you look at the 10 samples here at the example, what you do is every sample is basically put into multiple pools. In the diagram here, you can see that sample number 1 is basically put into pools A and pool B. And sample number 2 is put into pool A and pool C. So you can see that the goal is not to put the same sample with additional samples in every pool. So basically every sample meets other samples in various pools so that it's possible to identify which sample is in every pool. So the first step is selecting the right matrix. So this is, in this example, every sample is put in 2 pools, but it's possible to put one sample in 3 or 4 pools. And just so you know, if there's enough volume selected ahead of time. And this is basically the situation where you decide, after you decide what matrix you use, you then do the actual pooling. This is done with a pipetting robot most time, automated workbench. So this is something that our software can actually do and connects to any pipetting robot that works in large labs. And you can see that, you see this question mark. Basically, I said in the previous slide, we had samples and we put them in various pools, and we basically do not know which sample is positive, which sample is negative. But then what we receive is we receive results of the pools. And then in this case, for example, we see that pools B and E are positive and the rest are not. So this enables, first of all, to see which samples are negative, because you can see that which samples were put in which pools based on the initial matrix. Of course, this is a software that does this. We're a software company. The technology does this automatically. And once you have the pool results, you can extract the positive sample. So after previously not knowing which sample was positive and which is negative, due to the results of the pools, we can decipher which was the positive initial sample. And this is, of course, important to take into account the prevalence rate. And it really matters when you choose a matrix and how to set up this combinatorial setup. It depends on a lot of parameters, chiefly the prevalence rate and your other lab material and preferences. But this enables to cut the second step. And within one step, as you can see here, the second step here is a few seconds. It's basically mathematical, and just the software gets the results out of the pools directly, without having to open up these pools and test all the samples within them. Because we know that sample number 4 was in both pools B and E, the fact that both of them are positive, no other sample was in all of these pools. So this is something that can increase the throughput of labs and also reduce costs substantially. So this is the general idea of combinatorial matrix pooling. And if you can look at it as a large number of samples, here you can see this is an example of 4 plates in every lab. Depends, of course, on the lab, in the labware, but many labs use 96 or 384 plates, which is standard for many of the automated workbenches and the pipetting and the extraction and so forth and the PCR and the devices in the labs. But in this case, what we enable, and this is just one example, to take individual samples and put them into pools and have 96 when a plate basically enable 4 times or sometimes more, sometimes less. Of course, it depends here on the specific matrix and the prevalence rate and the details, but that enables you see in this example, basically to take from close to 400 individual samples to approximately 100 pools, which saves 75% of the samples that needed to be tested. That's basically the theory, but this is something we worked very hard this year to put into practice. And a lot of things, of course, in Zoom and places across the world we're in touch with. But in Israel, we literally we were very fortunate to experience ourselves in the labs. If you can see here at the bottom, this is a picture of the 96 well plate that I mentioned. And this is actually, this image is part of the validation accreditation we received in the central lab of Israel's Ministry of Health. And as Dr. Suda mentioned before, we're basically the first company in the world to receive regulatory approval from the Ministry of Health. And this was part of our journey to get this into practice, until basically what we're doing today at major mega labs and labs, including within Israel, the two of the largest HMOs, mega labs. So I want to dive into the CT value calculation. Dan mentioned it, and this is something we've been working and focusing on. A lot of the output is basically predicting, or basically giving the computation of the CT values. And in this case, we're basically basing it on the CT value of the pools, and it's possible to come very close to the original CT values. This analysis is basically based on comparing variation of the individual samples from the results of the samples based on the validation. So the reason is when you're doing when you're trying to compare, you have to have the side-by-side analysis. So we obviously have many experiments we've done where we don't have necessarily the data from the same day and as close as possible. But we've done an analysis based on many of the experiments in one specific lab that had it, because we're trying to present the accuracy. So as I said before, when I showed the combinatorial pooling, what we're doing in this case is we're taking pools in a 96 well plate, and we're receiving, in this example, we have 3 positive pools, and then we're extracting from the samples which sample is the positive one and its CT value. Of course, this depends on the kit and so forth and so on. And in this case, this is our software. You can actually upload the details and receive the results. And we mimic, and this basically outputs, which is very similar to a regular PCR result. What I will be presenting here is specific experiments. This is actually a specific subset of the experiments we've done in this framework at the Meuchedet HMO as part of a project of the Ministry of Health of validating this lab. And what we've done is over a couple of weeks, actually a couple of days, but within a span of a couple of weeks, we've done a series of experiments. This specific lab, the average right now, this is literally approximately 8,000 daily samples. And these experiments are blind experiments. So this is after we already received the accreditation from the Ministry of Health. So this is validating the lab to use combinatorial pooling. I'm going to take here one specific experiment example, and later on I'm going to also give a context of a combination of them. Here, this specific example, we used 400% efficiency with 2% prevalence. There were 7 samples that had computed CT values. The labware here specifically was Tecan Evo Freedom 200. The extraction was done on the same device. And the kit was CGen with 3 genes. When we looked at the calculation, the overall deviation, again, we did in the same time we did the pooling experiments and we did the individual sample CT value, and it was just 2.5% deviation, which is very exciting for the lab to hear, because it's something that basically means there's hardly any deviation. And this is, again, this is from the results. This is already diving a little bit deeper. You can see for every gene, it's a little different. In some cases, it's even 0.4% between the individual test result and the result that from the pooling. And this is something that enables the lab to feel comfortable using these results. This is one specific example. If you want to see the sample, you can see in each of the genes, it's a different deviation. But it's still, if there's a strong positive sample, the results for this patient will doesn't deviate substantially from the original. And if we look at overall, oh, this is another experiment. Actually, here I wanted to show also a larger deviation, but this is 7% prevalence with more positive samples. And here there was 9% deviation. So overall, all the results. Overall, if we're looking at all the this specific series of experiments of 4,500 samples and results, 15 different experiments and various prevalence rates. Here we actually use 2 different extraction devices, depending, labs has 6 or 7 different devices, but for these experiments, we use the Tecan and the Hamilton Starlet, depending on which experiment. And basically, from the results here, we saw that the overall difference was 6%. However, when we tried to test specifically where it was the same extraction device that was used for the individual samples and the pooled samples, we saw that it was actually lower. So that's basically something that we were the lab especially was very excited to see as well. And one of the things that, just specifically on this, is that it's very, sometimes this is very lab dependent and labware dependent and kit dependent and device dependent. So these things, the more experiments we've done and the more the lab feels interested in testing things in addition to the day-to-day integration. Looking at the future, we want to kind of mention a few things that are as background. We did launch the company in context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. However, we see that and learn, and as Idan's lab sees, there's a lot of other applications. Currently in blood banks, it's used to make sure they can use the blood donated. So this is something that's already partially used. Of course, COVID-19 has made this more widespreadly used, but even if we're looking to the future, and hopefully vaccine will be everywhere soon, it could be the many tests that are, whether they're sensitive like PCR, but various sensitivities, whether more sensitive or less sensitive, something that combinatorial pooling can be used for, including molecular tests such as this one. And the main advantage here is reduces costs because these tests are particularly high priced. There's some labs discussed with us moving some other tests that they had to be molecular because it wasn't efficient in the past, and there's something they're considering at the moment. And also immunologic tests. Basically, there are a few applications and things that can be used. If we dive a little bit deeper, some of the more common or popular ones, the most obvious ones is STDs, whether multiple ones like multiplex and a lot of tests together, but also things like syphilis. And if you remember when we started, I mentioned Robert Dorfman from World War II. It's interesting because it started as STDs and chlamydia. There's a bunch of different STDs that could be very relevant to test. It's basically, as we said, it's relevant in these cases. HIV, of course, especially in areas where there could be an outbreak, but it's something that could be in many other places that are testing. Women's health, it's actually interesting because CMV related to prenatal, which is something that low prevalence rate, so it's very fitting. But also HPV, that is something that, depending on the geography, but some places are extending, and early detection is very, helps prevent substantially. And we discussed before immunology, and celiac is something that people are more aware of in some places, and extending and widespread testing. And specifically, I mentioned local outbursts, but of course, with the SARS, COVID, COVID mutations and discussions that we do assume that it still will be a while that people will continue to be testing for this for a while, and in airports and so forth as well. Local outbursts like measles or other diseases, I mentioned HIV, and this is something that really is changing. Basically, the bottom line is that the focus is on wide population screening, whether it's specific local outbreaks or old age homes. There's in Israel, there's something screening for specific diseases and viruses. And basically, the entire the goal is for early detection and prevention with various diseases and pandemics where there's a low prevalence rate. This is very geography dependent because there are specific, more widespread local diseases, and also depends on regulation and the structure of the health insurance system and in general the health system. And the local HMOs and various restrictions, specifically now with COVID related, and various existing incentives and future changes. So this is something that we do see as innovation that we're very excited to have launched during the pandemic. We're working with labs now and in Israel and abroad, and we're very excited to be branching out into additional usages and being able to implement the method and help increase number of tests, actually help increase number of people tested with less tests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for sharing those exciting results with us. Raring to go on this. We're open to questions, and I'd like to start with a few, if you may allow me. The first question is to Idan. Idan, your results on the initial calibrations for sensitivity of pooling exercise. what would you think would be the impact with samples with low CTs? Typically samples with CT values more than 35, if you were to use them in pooling experiments, what would you think will be the impact on the readouts?
Right. So I think you can look at it in two ways. First, you cannot escape the fact that the CT value itself goes up. And for every dilution of 2, CT value goes up slightly more than 1. Okay? So this is a physical truth, right? You cannot escape that. However, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose the samples. In most cases, even samples that are considered relatively weak are not going to disappear. They're going to have a CT that is slightly higher of what we currently consider the borderline. But in almost all cases, they're still going to appear. And from our looking at the data, there's a very small number of, let's say, the fraction of samples that you are going to lose is an extremely small fraction. And if you would have the naive approach of, okay, we currently have a test that captures 100% of the samples, that's very naive, right? Even today, I think the test loses about misses, like false negative, gives false negative at least 10% of the time. I think compared to that, it's a very small change from the analysis that we've done. It's a very small change, a very slight increase in false negative. And then you have to do the calculation. Okay, if I'm going to be able to do, let's say, 3 times more tests and increase the false negative slightly, one has to do the calculation. Is it worth it or not? I saw actually there was a question about, is this approved? And from what I know, India was actually maybe even the first place in the world to allow pooling, right? Like the Indian Medical Council, am I saying it right?
Yes. ICMR approved simple pooling. So they were allowing pooling of 5 samples into one and retesting the positive pools. That was the only plan that has been approved by ICMR.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Idan. That gives some confidence. I have a couple of 2 more questions, and I'll open up for the audience. The other question I have is reporting quantitative versus qualitative, values. Essentially, if the downstream assays, for example, are not qPCR, if it's something else, have you tested this for anything other than qPCR, and what do the results look like? For example, if it's something that is like a colorimetric assay, which is seen on a lateral flow assay, what has your experience been if you have done any such thing? The question is open to both Idan and Ruth.
Should I take it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I say, okay, so this is true. This is very preliminary. The part of applying it to other things that are not COVID-19 are quite preliminary. What I would say is, we're now meeting in Zoom, and maybe you've noticed that the pandemic introduced many changes to our lives. One of them is that meetings are now in Zoom, and if you ask me, this change in behavior is going to last way beyond COVID-19. And I believe that this change of introducing automation and pooling to laboratories is something that happened because of COVID-19. And just like Zoom and some other habits that we've acquired in the previous half a year, it's going to stay. And this is a process post-COVID-19 of really introducing pooling to other laboratory tests.
Yeah, I would add to that some of the tests you mentioned are less sensitive than PCR. So these are in some of them, the results are binary versus more specific. So it's actually easier for the software to give results for those things. So it's something that's dumbing down the technology in a sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth and Idan. My last question is, have you formulated any kind of good laboratory practices that you would recommend when this is implemented in a lab, I mean, based on your past experience? I presume those would essentially form part of the guidelines if any accreditation has to be obtained by labs, because I see some questions related to that.
Yes, we have a set of protocols for implementing in a lab. Most of them are based on the Israeli Ministry of Health validation, which basically what the Ministry of Health requires is when we arrive at a lab, we have a set of experiments that we run in order to make sure that all the equipment and the kit and the materials and so forth are basically used with pooling, and there's no specific issue. So it's basically a set of practices, and have everything in protocol and documented. So there's something that when we get to a new lab, it's already set, and basically it could be done in several days. I will mention that there are basically two aspects to it. The first aspect is the labware and basically experiments and validation. And the second is IT integration. Basically, we're integrated completely, fully, because we work with mega labs, so they're usually high throughput, and they have, as I said, could be tens of thousands of samples per day, and something that has to be automated and has to be part of the logistics and part of the workflow of the lab. So that's something that we have a flow of doing experiments to kind of get into that flow, adding the IT integration, even though it's not actually necessary, but it's of course necessary for the long-term efficient work of the lab.
Thank you, Ruth. Some quick questions from the audience. Dr. Varsha Sridhar, she runs a diagnostic lab in Bangalore. Her question to you is, do you see an influence of the type of polymerase used for RT-PCR on pooling sizes?
When you choose pooling sizes, there's a lot of components. Usually, so we didn't see effects of that specifically, but it's a lot of times depending on the what are the important factors for you. So it's something that
I think I want to add to this. We have tried more than one kit, and we haven't tried all kits, but we have tried more than one kit, and it behaves very similarly. And I see no reason why it should, but the question is surely legitimate. That we don't know until we tried, and we have tried, and as far as we've seen, it behaves similarly for different kits.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth and Idan. The second question is from Nidhi, who's asking whether one would need approvals from CDSCO for using this in India. I guess it would be an yes, just like ICMR approved the 5 sample pooling, simple pooling. This would require approval, but it can be done as an individual lab, like one would do for any laboratory developed tests. The next question is from Tushar. He'd like to know from the presenters if CAP NABL allows this. I think it's a related question, which was answered. I don't know, Ruth, has this been implemented in any CAP accredited lab elsewhere?
Not that we're aware, but we do as we understand, it's something that, as you mentioned before, we could do it. As far as we know.
Thank you. Raja's question to the audience, if anyone has a liquid handler, either a Tecan, Hamilton, Beckman, or any other. Anyone in the audience has, please raise your hand if you could. Or just let us know.
Yeah, that's an important point, because basically I gave these examples as part of the robot and automated devices we use, but there are others that are possible. And basically it's a very rather simple integration of using our current software and making the integration. We already worked with, I believe we made the integration into 5 or 6 different ones, including the ones mentioned. So it's really a matter of what you already have in your lab. If you're not interested in purchasing a device specifically for pooling, because there's no need.
So we've done some testing with the Opentrons, and we'll keep you posted of the results. It's a very simple robo, not as sophisticated as a Tecan or a Beckman, but we believe it should do the trick. Let's see, we'll wait for the results to come. The question from Kirti Gupta, what are the disadvantages of going above the pool size 8? Can this be made possible by changing the protocol? Have you tried any?
Absolutely, yes. We've run many tests. Idan mentioned some of them, but we've run many tests, and some of the tests we've done is specifically the additional ones to check various dilutions. We had also food tests with higher dilutions, including up to 30. We've checked. We tested. We have many tests that were 14. Specifically, we, as Idan mentioned, above 16, 20, we're currently not advising and trying to be as conservative as possible. Obviously, it limits the efficiency. We could, with combinatorial pooling, in theory, have times 20 efficiency, but we believe times 4 efficiency is incredible on its own, and therefore we usually the labs we're working with choose to be conservative in the sense of dilution, and usually up to 16-ish is the most they go on.
Sorry, Dr. Yogendra Singh asks if we can use any ICMR approved kit for pool testing. I guess the answer would be yes. Yep.
Let's see, why not?
Yeah, you would be free to choose any kit downstream of pooling, as long as you've validated them to be working efficiently in your labs for individual testing. There's a question from Dr. Sudarshan from CanSite. He asks, how many times does the sample get diluted in pooling? I think it is 8 times. Ruth's data says there's not much change in CT after pooling. This is little surprising. Could you clarify?
I'll explain. This is not the results I showed, are not the results of the pools, or the results that our software, LessTests, is the ones that we take from the pools and we extrapolate what is the initial individual sample CT value, what it should be or what it is. And this is what we present, because that's what should be used. And in some cases where we're very fortunate and we have the ability to test the individual samples the same day and not, for instance, previous day and so forth, we made the comparison and we saw that the deviation was very low. And these are very exciting results, because that means that the method is accurate, comparatively speaking. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ruth. The last question of the session, Priyanka, I think, is asking you to reveal your secrets. She's asking you what would determine the dilution of the sample, and what volume of individual sample to be taken in a pool? How do you determine those?
Basically, the level of dilution is really depending on the preferences of the lab. I didn't have a chance to go into the details, but the lab can basically say, as I mentioned before, that they're more conservative or less conservative, and what are their preferences are as to the dilution, like Sudha mentioned, and also we done dilution of 8 and now going further, or dilution of 16, as I mentioned, and not going further. So that's one component. Another component is, which is very important, is the prevalence rate, which is basically really matters. What is the prevalence rate in the population, which will then have the recommended matrix. But there are other components. So it's really that part. Regarding the volume, this is related to the device, the extraction device, because the pools are after the pooling part, where the robot puts all the samples in the pools. Then it goes into extraction, and following that PCR. So you really have to extrapolate what is your extraction volume, and then go backwards to see in what matrix are you using, how many pools is each sample repeated in. But the software does that, just by the way. It's not something that you actually have to hand do. You just enter the extraction volume, and all the rest is calculated for you.
Thank you for the wonderful interactive session, Ruth and Nidan. Thanks for coming on board, and I'd like to thank everyone who participated in this discussion this afternoon. We'll be happy to take more questions. If there are, please write to us, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. And we're also, willing to test these for anyone who's wanting to test these methods in their current diagnostic labs. We're attempting to do that in another lab in Bangalore, which will start next week. And happy to do that in more labs, who is ready to test them. Thank you again. And if there are no more questions, we'd like to wish everyone a very good evening and a good afternoon to our friends in Israel.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for the questions.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.